more. Widesight TV.
So, Andrew, you spoke earlier on a panel about cross-sector learning. Of course, that's not a new idea. How have other sectors gone about doing just that?
So we had an excellent session today. I was really pleased with the input that we got from other sectors. So we had the aerospace sector, we had mathematical analysis tools and techniques with the oil and gas sector speak to us, and then manufacturing for composites in aerospace. What all of them were saying was, when we're doing problem solving, particularly big problems that are multi-million pound solutions, it helps massively to not just look at your bit of the problem, but to go to a true systems-based analysis of, if I pull this lever here, what happens over there down the line? So they were thinking about, in particular, how to get wider elements of the supply chain to come on board towards their design. That meant they had to be a lot clearer to the supply chain about what the common endeavour was that they wanted to achieve, as opposed to, I've designed this, can you build it for me? So a lot of deeper, true engagement to inspire their confidence to work together. And then, as I say, that system imperative, so looking more at, well, even if we are designing this project today, what are the longer term imperatives we might need to think about? And clearly for our sector and for some of the clients that I just mentioned, things like sustainability of product. So we've got to build all these solutions in to future-proof the ways forward, and that just naturally invites new players, new clientele to come and work with us, and then that starts to disrupt the thinking about what you've got for your specification for your project. The other thing that came out rather strongly today, which I was really pleased to hear about, is everybody's got their day job to do. Remember, we are a very efficient industry. As you know, with costs have come rapidly down, we're now a very, very competitive force for electricity. So everybody's got a day job to do to make sure they hit milestones on projects and hit targets, etc. So innovation doesn't come terribly naturally to people who don't have the time to take a step back to rethink that. So a couple of my panelists were suggesting, put catalysts into your team. You've got to change the culture towards innovation ultimately, but let's recognise you're changing an ecosystem within your own company. What you need are experts in innovation and people who can take that step back and have a think and challenge the norm within the business. Not to challenge to say don't do this, but to challenge and help them think through, as I say, all these other wider system imperatives. So as you create much more of a tour de force of true innovation and true learning and true, strong desire to make a change to the way that we do things, as opposed to grudgingly having to do it because the boss has said so, or because there's a new target to hit and I've got to think about a novel way to reduce costs. So, the typical industry challenges. So it's really interesting just to see how other sectors are, and I know we're doing it in our sector. I'm not saying we don't do it in our sector, but some of these manufacturing, particularly aerospace, automotive kind of sectors, they are really, taking it to heart on the challenges that are in front of them. And I really like this system perspective, as opposed to just simply the project that's here with us today. It's it's looking to the future, and it's looking to see what other actors you need to be working with to get the longer term solutions that you need.
So let's look at floating offshore wind through that exact lens you've just described. Where do you see the opportunities there?
So I'm a big fan of floating wind. It's a very novel and challenging concept. So we've got to think about turbines that are way bigger than the London Eye, on a very tall tower, sitting on a platform that floats on the sea and doesn't fall over, right? So for many people not involved with engineering, that's a pretty difficult concept to think about. And the real engineering challenge for floating wind is we need floating wind for net zero, because if we're going to reach the targets that the country has set for net zero, which is 100 gigawatts, so 10 times what we've got installed today, we've got to go to deeper water. And that suggests foundation solutions that aren't fixed to the seabed. They need to float on the sea surface. They're tethered, but they're still It's not a solid foundation going all the way down to the seabed. So we're going to have to think about the technologies that come into that. There are already prototypes that show that concepts are perfectly viable. But the real challenge is going to be how to build the substructures, which are the things that they sit on, the metal pieces or the concrete foundations that they sit on, to the scale and volume that we need. So it's actually almost the opposite of the challenge of what we had with fixed bottom technology, where the real challenge there was to get the cost down to be competitive, as I said earlier on. So that meant building turbines that were bigger and bigger and bigger. So you talk to the manufacturers of turbines, and they come up with solutions eventually. And then it's conceivable to see how many factories that can be built that can create the volume of turbines that come out. The foundation solution for floating wind is very, very different, because you can't build a single factory that can make them all. It's too big. So now we're going to have to think about solutions where we're asking multiple yards to come together to find the solution that the developers will ultimately need in order to put their turbines on when ready. So we've got a double challenge of making that technology better, but also asking the supply chain, who are used to competing with each other for singular orders, to come together to provide a product for a market that is, I think, got huge promise, but frankly is still in its infancy. So that's going to be a challenge for our sector about how to resolve that. And what I'm really pleased to see is the developer community who have strong interests in floating wind talk about the need for stronger collaboration at the developer level to think about how they can narrow down the very, very wide design spectrum that might come out from different actors coming up with different preferred solutions. Because if I was in supply chain, I wouldn't know how to scale up and what to make, because the order next week might be a completely different thing. So again, back to this kind of ecosystem challenge. We've had a super competitive industry, and I want competition to remain, but we now need to think about how can we bring a stronger collaborative element around all of that, because the supply chain will need it for floating wind. The balance, what we call the balance of plant, so that's the foundations and the cabling. The turbines will still be more or less the turbines, so we will still need to innovate the turbines towards floating wind. There'll be some technical aspects around it. And it may be things like tower strengthening, for example, because you've just got different forces as the things, because the foundations do move slightly. But the real challenge is going to be how to mobilise the yards to be creating the real scale to either pour enough concrete or to be welding enough steel tubes together to make the foundation designs that we want. And that will need public sector input to help on the infrastructure, such as port sizes, quayside laydown areas, etc. So it just invites a much stronger relationship between the supply chain and increasingly the balance of plant supply chain, as opposed to just the turbine supply chain, and the developers and the public sector to find an answer. And what I've always advocated in my role all throughout industry is I don't like to see triangles where everybody's sitting on each of the corners pointing at each other. You must solve this. The only solution is for everybody to come into the centre of the triangle and share the risk and share the vision, but share the risk about what's to be done to solve these challenges.
That's a really good analogy, and you've said that the developers are making really positive signals about collaboration. Overall, do you feel that there is a strong enough appetite for collaboration across the whole industry and beyond?
I think there's an appetite, for sure. I mean, and they were all echoing at this at the Floating Wind Offshore conference just the other week. So, and I know from my private discussions, yes, there's an appetite. The real challenge is going to be how to change the culture in the industry to allow them to do it. Because electricity was privatised in the early 1990s. People who entered the industry at that time have only ever known deep competition to win projects. And now we need to think about, well, can you share things a bit more readily? So that's not a fault of the people involved. It's just that all of their companies, all of their systems are designed for very efficient competition. So I think there's a willing. What we've got to think about is how to keep competition alive, quite clearly. We want competitive prices. But what is there behind the Competition Act that we need to be very, very mindful of, quite clearly. We don't want to be gaming markets or anything as mad as that. But there are clearly things we can do where we can think about, I don't want to use the word standards, but it is narrowing down the spectrum of design opportunities. So I often liken it to, I'm looking at your mobile phone here, you know, the industry decided we'll have 4G. They wrote a code of specification of 4G. Then all the device manufacturers went out and made different phones that answers to the 4G call and all the apps that go with it and so on. So there is a bit of codification kind of required somewhere, but that codification should allow innovation and product development, not stifle it. So there's a challenge around that too. But I think a lot of it is just, and then there are other things in the ecosystem. If you think about everybody has to compete for a site, everybody has to compete for a CFD, everybody has to compete for the supply chain that exists for the project. So there are a few other barriers in the ecosystem that, you know, I recognise need to be addressed somehow. So it's not going to happen overnight. But your question was, do I see willing? Yes, I see very strong willing, because we know to go from 10 gigawatts today to 100 gigawatts and not too far away, it strongly suggests we need to change the ecosystem that we've been working under. We've got to accelerate things, you know.
Energy. Energy. Marine. Energy. Power. Widesite TV.